In the dusty streets of Dakar, Abidjan, and Bamako, a new form of colonial exploitation is unfolding, one that doesn't require gunboats or formal treaties, but preys on the deepest aspirations of African people seeking opportunity and dignity. While the world watches geopolitical chess games between superpowers, a more insidious war is being waged against Africa's most vulnerable citizens, the systematic theft of their dreams through visa fraud schemes that have exploded across the continent like wildfire. The numbers are staggering. In just the first half of 2024, Canada alone refused over 52,000 temporary residence applications due to suspected fraud, a figure that already exceeds the entire year of 2023. But these aren't mere statistics. They represent thousands of African families who have been stripped of their life savings, their hope, and their faith in the possibility of a better future. This is economic warfare disguised as immigration policy, and it demands our urgent attention. Consider the story of Marie, a pseudonym for a woman whose experience represents countless others across French-speaking Africa. Approached by a so-called ghost consultant on Facebook, she was promised Canadian residency within 6 months in exchange for $15,000. The scammer vanished once the money was transferred, leaving Marie financially devastated and legally stranded. Her story is not unique. It is emblematic of a predatory system that has turned Africa's legitimate desire for global mobility into a hunting ground for international criminals. What makes this particularly insidious is how these scams exploit the very programs designed to bridge cultural and linguistic connections between Africa and the developed world. Canada's Francophone Mobility Scheme, launched in 2019 to strengthen French-speaking communities, has become a prime target for fraudsters who understand that desperation combined with hope creates the perfect conditions for exploitation. This isn't just theft, it's the weaponization of Africa's colonial languages against its own people. To understand the current visa fraud epidemic, we must first examine how economic colonialism has evolved in the 21st century. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 may have carved up Africa with arbitrary borders, but today's colonial project is far more sophisticated. It operates through immigration systems, visa regimes, and mobility frameworks that maintain global apartheid while appearing to offer opportunity. The roots of contemporary migration from Africa to the West can be traced directly to colonial disruption and its aftermath. French colonial policy in West Africa created economic dependencies that persist today through the CFA franc system, which continues to drain African wealth to European banks. British colonial extraction patterns established in Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone created structural imbalances that pushed talented Africans to seek opportunities in their former colonizers' territories. This isn't coincidence. It's the logical outcome of centuries of systematic underdevelopment. The visa scam phenomenon must be understood within this broader context of manufactured scarcity and artificial barriers to mobility. When France colonized West Africa, it created systems that extracted resources and labor while limiting local development. Today's visa requirements serve a similar function. They create artificial bottlenecks that force African citizens into vulnerable positions where they become easy targets for exploitation. The irony is particularly sharp when we consider programs like Canada's Francophone Mobility Scheme. While ostensibly designed to strengthen French-speaking communities in Canada, the program's very existence acknowledges a fundamental truth: Africa's human capital is valuable enough to be actively recruited by developed nations. Yet the same systems that seek to extract this talent create conditions that make fraud inevitable. Historical precedent shows us that whenever colonial powers have created legitimate pathways for African advancement, they have simultaneously created shadow systems of exploitation. The colonial recruitment of African soldiers for European wars, the post-independence brain drain programs, and now the visa fraud epidemic all follow the same pattern. Official channels that appear to offer opportunity, while unofficial networks extract maximum value from African desperation. The emergence of ghost consultants represents a particularly modern form of this exploitation. These fraudsters operate in the digital shadows, using social media platforms and WhatsApp groups to reach victims across vast distances. They understand African languages, cultural references, and most importantly, the specific dreams and aspirations that drive emigration. This isn't random crime, it's targeted predation that exploits intimate knowledge of African psychology and circumstances. The visa fraud epidemic targeting Africa operates with the precision of a well-oiled machine, exploiting every vulnerability in the current global mobility system. To understand its devastating impact, we must examine not just the mechanics of these scams, but their deeper implications for African sovereignty and self-determination. The numbers emerging from Canada paint a particularly troubling picture. The Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association reports that fraud-related visa refusals have increased by more than 13% in just 1 year, with the vast majority of victims coming from Africa. This isn't merely a law enforcement issue, it's a systematic exploitation of the gap between African aspirations and global mobility restrictions. The Francophone Mobility Scheme, which anticipates nearly 80,000 French-speaking African residents migrating to Canada by 2027, has become ground zero for this exploitation. The program's expansion in 2023 created a perfect storm, increased awareness of opportunities combined with limited official information channels and inadequate fraud prevention measures. Criminals quickly identified this as a prime hunting ground, developing sophisticated operations that mirror legitimate immigration processes. The psychological manipulation employed by these scammers reveals a deep understanding of African cultural values and economic realities. They don't simply promise visas, they promise dignity, security, and the chance to provide for extended families. In societies where collective responsibility means that one person's success can transform entire communities, the pressure to pursue any opportunity, regardless of risk, becomes overwhelming. Marie's story illustrates this perfectly. The scammer didn't just promise her a visa, he promised her a complete transformation, job security, permanent residency, and most importantly, the ability to bring her family to safety. The $15,000 she lost wasn't just her money, it represented the pooled resources of her entire extended network, people who believed in her dream and trusted in her judgment. When she was scammed, it wasn't just her future that was stolen, it was the collective hope of her community. The speed element in these scams is particularly insidious. Scammers create artificial urgency, claiming that Canadian immigration policies are about to change, or that slots are limited. This psychological pressure prevents victims from conducting due diligence or seeking second opinions. They exploit the very efficiency that legitimate African entrepreneurs and professionals bring to their endeavors, turning decisiveness into vulnerability. The financial impact extends far beyond individual victims. When $15,000 is stolen from an African family, it often represents years of savings, sold assets, and borrowed money. In countries where the average annual income hovers around $2,000, such losses can be financially catastrophic for generations. This isn't just theft. It's the systematic impoverishment of Africa's most ambitious citizens. But the damage goes deeper than money. Each successful scam creates ripple effects that undermine legitimate immigration pathways. When Marie's story spreads through her community, it doesn't just warn others about scams. It creates suspicion about all immigration opportunities. This fear and mistrust serve the interests of those who benefit from keeping African talent trapped in artificially constrained circumstances. The gender dimensions of this exploitation are equally concerning. Many victims are women like Marie, who see emigration as a way to escape limited opportunities and social restrictions. The scammers understand this vulnerability and specifically target women with promises of economic independence and security. When these women are defrauded, they face not just financial loss, but social stigma and diminished credibility within their communities. The technological sophistication of these operations cannot be understated. Modern visa scammers operate across multiple platforms using encrypted communications, fake government websites, and sophisticated document forgery. They maintain the appearance of legitimate businesses, complete with professional websites, testimonials, and even fake government partnerships. This technological sophistication makes them particularly dangerous to populations who may lack experience with digital fraud detection. The international nature of these crimes creates additional complications. Scammers often operate from multiple countries, moving money through complex networks that make investigation and prosecution extremely difficult. By the time victims realize they've been defrauded, the perpetrators have often moved on to new locations and new identities, leaving behind only digital breadcrumbs and devastated families. The visa fraud epidemic represents more than criminal opportunism. It constitutes a form of soft warfare against African sovereignty and development. When we examine the geopolitical dimensions of this crisis, we uncover a systematic effort to maintain global hierarchies through the manipulation of African aspirations and the exploitation of legitimate migration desires. The targeting of French-speaking African countries is particularly revealing. France's ongoing neo-colonial relationship with its former African colonies creates a complex web of dependencies and expectations. The CFA franc system ensures that African wealth continues to flow to French banks, while visa restrictions maintain artificial scarcity around opportunities for African citizens. Into this deliberately created gap step the fraudsters, profiting from the very inequalities that French policy helps maintain. Canada's role in this system is equally problematic. While the Francophone mobility scheme appears to offer opportunities for African advancement, its implementation reveals the inherent contradictions in Western immigration policy. The program actively recruits African talent while simultaneously creating conditions that make fraud inevitable. This isn't accidental, it's the logical outcome of policies designed to extract maximum value from African human capital while minimizing responsibility for African development. The economic warfare aspect of visa fraud becomes clear when we consider its impact on African development. Every talented professional, skilled worker, or educated individual who is defrauded represents a loss not just to their family, but to their entire country. These are often the very people who would have contributed significantly to local development if legitimate opportunities existed within Africa itself. The United Kingdom's post-Brexit visa schemes follow a similar pattern. The targeting of social care workers from Africa for fraudulent schemes reveals how immigration policy can be weaponized against vulnerable populations. When legitimate care companies lose their licenses due to fraud, it's not just the scammers who suffer. It's the African workers who lose faith in official channels and the UK institutions that lose credibility. The American dimension adds another layer of complexity. The Federal Trade Commission's data showing that immigration fraud complaints doubled from 2023 to 2024 suggests that this isn't a localized problem, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation. The United States, as the global hegemon, bears particular responsibility for creating international conditions that make such fraud possible. The G7's Global Fraud Summit represents a typical Western response to problems they've helped create. While the 4-point framework for combating fraud sounds impressive, it focuses on law enforcement cooperation rather than addressing the underlying inequalities that make fraud attractive. This approach treats symptoms while ignoring causes, ensuring that the fundamental power imbalances remain intact. The intelligence sharing component of the G7 framework is particularly concerning from an African sovereignty perspective. Enhanced cooperation between Western intelligence agencies in tracking African citizens' movements and communications raises serious questions about surveillance and privacy. This could easily become another tool for monitoring and controlling African populations under the guise of fraud prevention. Regional implications within Africa are equally significant. Countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal are losing their most educated and ambitious citizens to both legitimate emigration and fraud-related losses. This brain drain, accelerated by visa scams, weakens these nations' capacity for self-directed development and increases their dependence on external assistance. The Chinese and Russian responses to this crisis offer interesting alternatives. Both countries have begun expanding their visa programs for African citizens, often with less bureaucratic complexity than Western systems. This represents a geopolitical opportunity for African nations to diversify their international partnerships and reduce dependence on former colonial powers. The visa fraud epidemic strikes at the heart of African cultural values and collective aspirations, representing an assault on the very foundations of African social organization and future planning. To understand the full impact of this crisis, we must examine how these scams exploit and distort fundamental African cultural concepts. In many African societies, emigration is viewed not as individual advancement, but as collective investment. When a family pools resources to send one member abroad, they're not just investing in that person's future, they're investing in the future of entire extended networks. The concept of Ubuntu, prevalent across southern Africa, emphasizes that individual success is meaningless without collective advancement. Visa scammers understand this cultural framework and exploit it ruthlessly. The respect for education and professional achievement in African cultures makes certain individuals particularly vulnerable to fraud. In societies where academic success is celebrated collectively, the pressure to pursue any opportunity for advancement becomes overwhelming. Scammers specifically target educated individuals, knowing that their cultural status makes them more likely to be trusted with family resources and more motivated to take risks. The oral tradition and communication patterns prevalent in many African cultures create additional vulnerabilities. Stories of successful emigration spread quickly through communities, often growing in the telling and creating unrealistic expectations about opportunities abroad. Scammers exploit these communication networks using culturally appropriate language and references to build trust and credibility. The concept of time in many African cultures also plays into scammers' hands. The emphasis on seizing opportunities when they arise, combined with respect for authority figures and professional expertise, creates conditions where artificial urgency becomes particularly effective. When a consultant claims that immigration policies are about to change, cultural values around quick decision-making can override natural caution. Religious and spiritual dimensions add another layer of complexity. Many African cultures view emigration through spiritual lenses, seeing it as part of divine destiny or ancestral guidance. Scammers often incorporate religious language and concepts into their pitches, positioning themselves as instruments of divine will or ancestral blessing. This spiritual manipulation is particularly devastating because it attacks the very faith systems that provide meaning and resilience to African communities. The generational impact of visa fraud on African cultures cannot be understated. When elders lose their savings to scammers, it's not just their individual future that's compromised, it's the entire intergenerational wealth transfer system that has sustained African families for millennia. This disruption of traditional economic relationships weakens the social fabric that holds communities together. The visa fraud epidemic targeting Africa represents a clarion call for genuine sovereignty and self-determination. As we've seen throughout this analysis, these scams aren't merely criminal opportunism, they're symptoms of a global system designed to maintain African dependence and extract maximum value from African aspirations while providing minimal opportunities for legitimate advancement. The time has come for African leaders, institutions, and citizens to recognize that true sovereignty means creating conditions where emigration becomes a choice rather than a necessity. When young Africans feel compelled to risk everything for opportunities abroad, it reflects not just individual ambition, but systemic failure to create dignified opportunities at home. The solution requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both immediate protection needs and long-term structural changes. African governments must invest in robust fraud prevention systems, but more importantly, they must create economic conditions that make emigration attractive rather than desperate. This means challenging the very neo-colonial relationships that create artificial scarcity and dependency. Educational campaigns alone cannot solve this crisis. While African citizens need better information about immigration scams, they also need real alternatives. The energy and resources that drive emigration must be redirected toward African development projects that offer genuine opportunities for advancement and contribution. The digital revolution offers unprecedented opportunities for African innovation and entrepreneurship. Instead of using technology to seek opportunities abroad, African youth can leverage digital platforms to create value within African markets. This requires investment in infrastructure, education, and regulatory frameworks frameworks that support indigenous innovation. Regional integration represents another crucial element of the solution. The African Continental Free Trade Area creates opportunities for intra-African mobility that could reduce dependence on Western immigration systems. When Africans can move freely within their own continent for education, business, and opportunity, the appeal of risky immigration schemes diminishes significantly. The diaspora community bears special responsibility in addressing this crisis. African professionals who have successfully navigated legitimate immigration pathways must become active in educating their communities about both opportunities and dangers. This peer-to-peer education is often more effective than official warnings because it comes from trusted sources who understand the cultural context. Financial inclusion initiatives can also play a crucial role in fraud prevention. When African citizens have access to legitimate financial services and investment opportunities, they're less likely to be attracted to schemes that promise unrealistic returns. Mobile banking and digital financial services offer particular promise in this regard. The international community, particularly Western nations that benefit from African talent, must also accept responsibility for creating conditions that make fraud attractive. This means not just law enforcement cooperation, but fundamental reforms to immigration systems that currently create artificial scarcity and desperate vulnerability. African media organizations have a crucial role to play in exposing these scams while also celebrating legitimate success stories. Instead of focusing solely on immigration achievements, African media should highlight local entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders who are creating value within African contexts. The future of African sovereignty depends on our ability to transform the energy and ambition that currently drives emigration into force for continental development. This doesn't mean opposing legitimate mobility, it means creating conditions where mobility becomes a choice rather than a survival strategy. Every like, share, and subscription to this channel represents a vote for African sovereignty and authentic development. When you engage with this content, you're not just supporting a YouTube channel. You're supporting a movement that believes in Africa's capacity for self-directed development and authentic progress. This is why your engagement matters so much. Hit that like button to signal your support for African sovereignty. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about the real issues affecting African development. Share this video with your networks to spread awareness about these critical issues. And most importantly, ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest analysis of the forces shaping Africa's future. Together, we can build a future where African dreams are nurtured within African contexts, where our continent's vast human capital serves African development, and where the next generation of African leaders emerges from African institutions, pursuing African solutions to African challenges. The time for authentic sovereignty is now, and your support makes this movement possible. Subscribe, like, share, and let's build Africa's future together.